All right, folks, welcome to today's webinar, Connect the Data Dots to Improve Patient Care and Operations. We're going to quickly run through a few logistical items before we go ahead and get started, and this will also allow folks to jump on and join us. So just as a reminder, this is a live webinar and will be recorded. We'll make the links available within about 72 hours after the event. They will be emailed to you as well using the email addresses that you had used for registration. There is also a Q&A portion at the end of this that we will try our best to get to after the fireside chat. But you're more than welcome and encouraged to ask your questions using the chat function in the platform. And we also have a team on standby to be able to answer those questions via chat. And we also encourage you to continue your learning today with Starburst and checking out our Healthcare for Life Sciences page to learn more about how Starburst is enabling payers, providers, and life sciences organizations around the world to connect their data and improve patient care and operations. So awesome to see folks coming in. Looks like we had a gentleman say from Idaho and a few other places. I know the speakers today are globally dispersed across 4 different time zones. From West Coast, Central, and East Coast in the U.S. And then one of our speakers is in a Parisian hotel room. So you could guess which one that is when we get those speakers all on the screen as well. All right, awesome. Let's go ahead and get going. Fairly awesome lineup of speakers today, right? We have David Berkowitz joining us from Novant Health, a customer of Starburst as well. Adrian Estala, who's our VP and Field Chief Data Officer from Starburst, and then John Marshall, who is from Slalom as a Senior Principal Data and Analytics Strategist there. And Slalom is a Tier 1 partner of Starburst as well. So we'll be getting to these gentlemen later in the talk today, as far as hearing from their experiences of how they're using data to improve patient care and operations as well. And the agenda is extremely packed. So our goal is to be able to get through all this content within a timely manner and make sure you guys learn as well as have fun and get out on time. And so without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and invite Adrian to actually kick us off and getting back to the basics in order to move forward.
Thank you, Manveer. Appreciate your time. So I always like to start. I don't always like to start, but I always enjoy when I am able to start with an Einstein quote. And this one's interesting. I've seen this one over the years on the data side. And as an architect, we look at this and we say, hey, we can't blame architects or engineers for the decisions we made in the past. And when I first read this, it was another presenter talking about all the mistakes we made in the past. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think we definitely need to revisit and rethink these problems. But I think all of us, with the gray hair, so to speak, I think if we look at the decisions that led us to the current architectures, those decisions were made on sound, facts, so to speak. We had based on all the information we had at hand, we drove our architecture and we drove our strategy in a certain direction. It's not to say that they were mistakes. It's simply to say that where we are today, we need to reset that approach. We need to reset the thinking, so to speak. And so what we're going to ask you today is to try to reimagine it a little bit and kind of rethink how we can move forward from this point. Again, taking all the facts that we have available today and kind of embracing the change that's ahead of us. So we take a look at the next slide, kind of what's coming down the road. I just say we want to embrace the change. And so when we think of data architecture perspective, and we embrace the fact that we are multi-cloud. I was in a group recently, a big group of customers, and most of them were on 2 or 3 clouds. And so multi-cloud is a reality for a lot of companies. In healthcare, I think more and more you're starting to see a multi-cloud environment. On-prem is a reality for healthcare, right? For a lot of what we do, it's going to stay on-prem. And so there's going to be this continued idea of, and you hear these terms over and over about volume, variety, and velocity. And so the complexity of that data architecture is something that we have to embrace, right? That diversity, that change, we can't get away from it, right? The idea of trying to move all that into one spot, that's not going to work, right? We need to kind of move away from that original thinking and open our minds up to embracing a model that's going to allow us to continue to deal with what we have in front of us. When we think about that architecture and we think about how we transform data from that architecture, I think the transformation there, the data transformation there, really needs to shift more towards a product mindset, right? And so in the old days, we build big projects. Those big projects deliver big data programs, and that takes time. And then when they're closed, the team leaves. In a product-oriented world, what we're talking about is having dedicated product teams focused on specific health problems or specific company issues and challenges, and they stick with that problem, they stick with that opportunity over a longer term. And so that product mindset is really what we're trying to drive more so, not only with data transformation, but with really everything we do in an organization. The old age of building pipelines to data sets, it doesn't work. It takes too long, right? I don't have the time to build a pipeline to everything. I don't have the time to wait to merge everything. And so I need to really think about how I do transformation today in a modern world, right? If I can't build that pipeline, what else can I do, right? How else am I able to federate? And so federation is really important, but really, again, rethinking how we do that federation. And at the end of the day, when we do transformation, we want to make sure that we are paying a special attention, if you will, or special attention to the resources that were overwhelming. All of us are tasked. If there's data engineers in the call, you would appreciate the fact that there's probably a backlog sitting as soon as you get off the call that you need to go address, so to speak, right? I'm happy that you're joining the call, but you probably don't have time. You've got a lot of work to do, so to speak. And so the idea of trying to figure out how we can share the load, right? And so in a modern data transformation approach, we would say, I've got data engineers that can do some work, but I've also enabled other teams to do more work, right? So we need product-focused teams that are really enabled to do more of their transformation, right? Self-service, autonomous teams. And that consumer that I'm talking about, that consumer that we're going to enable, they're more powerful, right? They have stronger BI tools, right? They have access to AI algorithms, right? And now they're starting to use ChatGPT to write their own code. And so it's a much smarter, much more capable consumer. If we can just find a way to get them the data, if we can find a way to enable them, it really opens the door to the capabilities that we can deliver as a larger data platform or from an organizational perspective. Let's take a look at the next slide to think about what some of the things that we can do, right? And so if this is revisiting what we have to embrace today, how do we fix that? If we start thinking about some of the trends that we're seeing in terms of the architecture, embracing the complexity, the transformation, moving to product focused, and the consumer, the enablement of that consumer, I want to offer you 3 ideas, and you'll hear more about these ideas in Manvir's next section. First thing I want to offer you is data federation, right? The idea of leveraging the data where it sits. We love lakes, right? And we'll talk about data lake analytics as well here. If you've got lakes and you have data in the lake, that's a fantastic place for you to start your journey. It's a fantastic place for you to do your analytics. We can't get everything that we have in a lake. We can't get everything that we have in a single lake. Oftentimes, most of us, we have many lakes and we have other data sources that can't get into the lake. So the idea of being able to federate with those other sources while still exploiting everything that we have in the lake, that's a powerful capability. And what's interesting is, and what's powerful about that is that that's a capability that most of us can achieve right now, right? We can deliver that today without creating any massive changes across the architecture. It's basically leveraging what's already in place through federation and through a tool like Trino and Starburst. But what's more powerful about that is once you're able to get that data accessed and once you're able to kind of get that data integrated, it's the ability to build data products. If we can fix via data federation and faster data lake analytics, the challenges we're dealing with on the back end, then we can empower that consumer on the front end. And with the way that we empower that consumer is we give them data products that are very easy for them to find. I have a headache. I go to a pharmacy. I know exactly what aisle to go to, and I know exactly how to look at the different packages for medication. It's the same way that we want data consumers to shop for data products. I know exactly where to go to find the data products that I need, and I can browse through the different data products that are available to me until I find exactly what I want. And if I have access, if I'm authorized, I can open up that data package, that data product, and actually use the data. And so making it easier for the consumer to leverage data via data products that are enabled in a very high performant way through data analytics, data lake analytics, and federation really, I think, is a key to success on the healthcare side. And it's what we're seeing more and more with a lot of our healthcare customers. I'll pause, Manvir, because I know you're going to dig a lot deeper into this. And so I can't wait to see what you tell us in the Starburst side.
No, awesome. Thanks, Adrian. Yeah, super helpful. And as you think about, as Adrian has mentioned, right, these kind of 3 core components as you think about designing for the future with flexibility. It is about that federation, right? It is about that analytics on the lake moving forward, and it's about data products. So how do you productize it to make it easier, as Adrian mentioned? So when in the world of, or the reality that we're all living in today, right? The reality is that ultimately, whether it's intentional or not, nearly every business that we engage with, we're finding that, data silos, right? And so we know these are rice grain silos, and they represent the best, depiction of what a data silo could look like. But they're a problem across data architectures, right? So the data that you need is there, but it's spread across your organization, and the value you can extract from that data is limited by your ability to access and organize it. And so it's not just saying, it's just not us saying this, right? So a recent BCG report, which surveyed 300 of your peers or your leaders, found that more than 50% of the respondents said architectural complexity is a significant problem. And so as a result, many companies are now finding themselves at this tipping point at, a risk of drowning in this deluge of data and just simply overburdened by the complexities and the costs that are coming from these pains. But how did we get here? Data silos are not anything new. In fact, it'd be great to know if, how many of you have data silos. So please put that into your chat. It's all anonymous, I believe. But it's like, how many of you are, challenged by this problem? And the thing is that, they continue to be a challenge despite the best efforts to create this mythical utopian single source of truth that we've been trying to pursue for decade after decade, for the last 30 plus years. So let's quickly talk about how this tends to happen. As new and different types of data are introduced, you end up with a growing patchwork of disparate technologies and systems. These data silos are inherently difficult to maintain and access, which leads to ultimately slower time to insight. And what traditional data lakes and data warehouses attempted to do was to address the problem by requiring all the data be landed in their proprietary systems, right? So they forced you to access everything through their systems. But this wasn't really feasible because these systems are monolithic architectures, and they're built on these closed ecosystems and are just difficult to scale up or down as the business needs. And in healthcare, we've seen this over the last several years of the ability and the need for scaling is more important than ever before, right? How do you anticipate the next pandemic? How do you anticipate the next flu season or a power bloom as we're having in California, right, with all the pollen and allergy attacks, which I suffer from. So how do you anticipate these, this fluctuating scale that you need to be able to address to? And so over time, as you introduce new types of data, new use cases and applications, and obviously the growing volumes of data, the monolithic nature of these systems essentially forces you to layer on new technologies and data sources to adapt to your needs. The thing is that this also gets further exacerbated as you think about globally distributed data or regionally distributed data within the US. So if you're a provider, right, if you have multiple facilities across different state lines, how do you preserve the data of patients within one state to the next? Or if you're a life sciences organization operating in multiple countries, dealing with data sovereignty requirements there. There's third-party data that you may be sourcing. All of these come with different retention policies, different access policies that you have to figure out and manage. So this only leads to more disparate systems. And again, we end up with data silos, but only it gets worse and worse over time. And so this is also leading to something that has unintended consequences, as highly valuable and scarce data science and data engineering resources are spending up to weeks just on discoverability and data access before even knowing anything about that quality of data or the relevance of the data, which is grossly delaying key initiatives, but also driving low productivity amongst this cohort that thrives on experimentation, on innovation, and just moving fast. So with the churn in this skilled workforce, it then further delays any planned business, data science, machine learning, analytics capabilities that you may have on the docket. So the question isn't so much about how we got here. We know how we got here because it's a decades-old problem of how we got here. But the question now is about where do we go from here? And at Starburst, we believe that the modern data lake or a data lakehouse architecture actually solves many of the problems that we just discussed. So what do we mean by a modern data lake? Well, there are four core components that make up the modern data lake. And you're going to hear me mention fours quite a lot. You're going to see this recurring theme of fours, right? But the first is that it needs to be built on commodity storage and compute, which means that you could scale up and down in a cost-effective way. Second, it needs to be built on open file and table formats, which means your data is portable, and most importantly, it stays yours, which is extremely critical as we move forward, and especially with PHI and healthcare data in general. Like, that is your data and needs to be yours. Of course, we also need the high performance and scalable query engine to query all that data. And finally, we need the ability to be able to access all that data that won't live in the lake, right? So as Adrian mentioned, the lake can easily become the center of gravity, but the reality is you're going to have all these other data sources that aren't necessarily in that center of gravity with the lake. So with this type of architecture, many of the challenges that data silos presented can be solved, right? So this provides that single point of access and governance. So you take point that I said single point of access, not a single point or a single source of truth. So it's how do you access all the different data sets versus having data reside in a single monolithic architecture. You also get advanced warehouse-like capabilities directly on the data in the lake, an architecture that is vendor agnostic because you're building off of open source technologies, and a system that is scalable and cost effective. And so, before diving into anything further, as you know, or you may know, Starburst is actually built on top of a powerful open source technology called Trino, which has been deployed and scaled at some of the largest internet companies in the world. So once again, speaking to that open nature and that portability and the data, where data ownership and data stewardship is yours, it's actually ingrained into the way we think about things. And so, but building all this architecture yourself, and if you recall the logos on the slide that I just showed previously, it's a daunting task if you're going to go do it on your own, especially relying all on these open source technologies, right? And there's only a few organizations in the world, the logos that you saw, plus a handful of others that have the skills, the resources, and the patience to be able to go do that. Because what it requires that, well, the management component is all manual. There's no auto scaling capabilities that are pre-built for you. From a security perspective, well, there is no built-in security integrations. You got to go do that on your own. For access control, well, you got to require third parties for your basic things just run RBAC, so with role-based access control. And from a support perspective, well, there is no support team that you could call when things go south because you're reliant on community responsiveness. So though building completely something from scratch on your own, like there's some form of self-satisfaction and ownership to it. It is also, full of challenges, and you have to be, deliberate about whether you're taking those challenges on or not and becoming your own IT company or technology company. And so to make this a possibility for all of the data first organizations on the planet, Starburst has simplified this to create the easiest way to build and manage your modern data lake. And so at Starburst, we believe that the modern data lake will become that data center of gravity for many organizations. And Starburst will provide the data lakes analytics platform to help activate the data in the lake and also around the lake. So, our customers will typically have their data center of gravity in a data lake, but also depend on many other data sources, which may evolve over time as needs change. For instance, like modern applications often require a combination of data technologies that include historical data, stored on the lake, streaming event data, log data, application data, and so on. And there will always be new types of data and data sources created by different business needs to the development of new technologies and applications. So think about the example from yesterday when Apple just announced this new AR/VR headset. And that begins to show up in the operating theater and the telemetry data that you're going to start collecting from that. Or any other new sensors that are coming out for pacemakers, or just your health watches or fitness watches. Those are all new data sets or new data streams that will be coming in that you have to now factor into your architecture. So Starburst not only helps you access the data in the lake, but also can directly access the data outside the lake. We can also help you move the data in the lake and transform that data within your lake for better sharing and consumption. So you could get the center of here. It's all about the lake. So let's double click and see what makes up the Starburst Data Lake Analytics platform. In Starburst, there are 4 core pillars, or 4 layers, right? So once again, reiterating the power of 4 here. We start off with the data access layer for connecting all your data sources in and around your lake. So this also includes your unique Stargate connectivity, which allows customers to connect sources across regions, across clouds, and between clouds and on-premise environments. That's huge when you think about it from what Adrian said earlier about being a true multi-cloud architecture. of how do you actually take advantage of all the data that sits in all those different clouds or your on-premise environment or a combination of anything else. Second is going to be that security and governance layer, which includes all the capabilities that you need to manage access, privacy, encryption, as well as things like monitoring and logging. So this is extremely critical, especially in a highly regulated space like healthcare and life sciences, where you have to protect PHI, right? So think about those electronic medical records and how do you protect that sensitive information? And even your clinical trials and all that data if you're in the research side of the house. Next, we have the query engine, which for us is built on open source Trino. And we've added a significant amount of proprietary features here to beef up, the capabilities, which includes warp speed, which allows you to get significant query response times, what you would expect from an optimized data warehouse. But remember, this is now on a lake instead of the warehouse itself. And also, as a part of the engine, we offer fault-tolerant execution, which means long-running queries and complex transformation jobs will not fail just due to out-of-memory limitations. So that problem goes away. And finally, we've built the modeling and semantic layer, which includes all the features to help you build, organize, and share data models with standard SQL. So when you think about from that resourcing challenge we talked about, the need for finding people with niche skill sets on niche languages goes away in the context of your analytics capabilities because we're using a global standard with SQL. Now, we also work with an extensive network of partners to bring you the most popular third-party integrations. And if you have a preference or are working with somebody, that's great. Or you want to work with somebody else. And this includes all major BI vendors that you'd expect. So like Power BI, Tableau, and Looker. You got your transformation tools like dbt, and a number of security and governance providers such as like Immuta, Calibra, and Elation. And so now that you know a bit about the product capabilities, we're going to shift a little bit of the gears to discuss how we actually help and how we fit into your reality, right? And we'll cover three major patterns that we see. First is if you are challenged with data silos, which we've talked about already to this point, right? Starburst can help by creating this single point of access across all your silos. If you have already tried a legacy data lake, but are struggling to get, say, value from it, we can help bring warehouse-like capabilities directly to the lake and help you activate that data. And if you're relying only on a data warehouse for analytics, well, we can help you de-risk that investment and make that warehouse like a component of the broader data strategy versus it being the only thing, right? So let's talk a bit about how we do some of these things exactly. So in this case, for the problems of data silos, we help you federate and unify the disparate data in your ecosystem. This means creating that single point of access. And some organizations may also use this as a starting point to build out a data mesh as well. For legacy data lakes, like we help you modernize, right? So Starburst supports all the modern tables and file formats that you'd expect and can be the engine that helps you transform, structure, and share data directly in the lake. Now, if you just want to stay with Hadoop, for example, say, replace your old Hive or Impala query engine, we can definitely do that too, but, also offer you better performance and costs along the way. And lastly, for those of you who are feeling a bit too dependent on your data warehouse, we help by unlocking the value in the object storage that you probably already have. And for example, this is taking the recommended guidance from the leading cloud data warehouse provider today. But the recommendation for AWS is that you first move, for this cloud provider using AWS, is to first move all that data into S3 staging environment. So in other words, you're moving all that data into a cloud data lake first. Then this cloud data warehouse recommends loading the full data set into their system, where then they'll charge you for all the cleanup and the raw data from raw data to consumable tables. So with Starburst, we can actually run high performance data lake analytics on S3 and help you choose, right? So it's no longer a requirement, but actually choose which data should move into the data warehouse. Because Starburst provides that warehouse-like capabilities on the data lake, you don't need to put all your data into an expensive and rigid data warehouse anymore. But maybe you do still want to put some of your first-class BI and reporting data there, and that's perfectly okay. But for everything else, it's probably going to be more scalable and more efficient to leave it in the lake. So, ultimately, our goal is to provide customers with 4 simple benefits. So once again, the power of 4 here. The first is going to be simplicity. This means helping you take the fastest path from data to insight, making things easy to deploy, easy to manage, and easy to use. Next is going to be access. We want to help you future-proof your architecture by ensuring access and governance to all your data today, tomorrow, a year from now, or several years from now. Scalability. Starburst was born of a technology developed for one of the largest internet companies in the world, right? So if we think about just the sheer scale that you could run this to if you needed to. We want to make it efficient and easy to run at any scale that you need today. So whether you need to scale up a lot because there's another pandemic, or like you're seeing a surge of certain types of cases coming through in a certain area, or if you need to scale down because, well, it's, people are on vacation and no one's getting hurt. And then lastly, optionality. We've said this before, but in order to break that cycle of data silos, and that pursuit towards a single source of truth that tends to be unattainable, you need your data to be your data. We work with any data in any storage, so you never have to worry about locking yourself into a proprietary data ecosystem. And what this translates into for you and your business partners is ultimately three things. The first is that we're enhancing patient experiences and outcomes. So think about, how do you provide highly personalized and proactive care plans that reduce the burden on patients and readmission rates at the same time? But it also increases in-network adoption and yields overall better data-driven decisions. From an operational efficiencies perspective, how do you gain a holistic view of end-to-end operations to implement cost savings and productivity-focused efficiencies across payments and claims, across drug discovery, across facilities operations, and just the overall analytics tech stack itself? And lastly, from a regulatory perspective and risks, like implementing the data framework that to increase patient retention, improve fraud detection, and detect anomalies in operations that can cause regulatory scrutiny. So think about your med cart and the audits that you have to conduct on that med cart for opioids being distributed to patients. And how do you log and track that and run the analytics there in a much more efficient way? So just over 5.5 years old, which most people may not know, but Starburst is just 5.5 years old. We're helping organizations of all sizes, from large enterprises, multinationals, to startups and digital native organizations, realize the value that we've discussed. And healthcare and life sciences is no different, with 4 of the top 10 global life sciences organizations leveraging Starburst's data lake analytics platform, alongside some of the leading providers and payers in the US, North America, and Europe. So let's dive in to see how 2 of these customers are benefiting today. And then I promise we'll go quickly shift over to the fireside chat, which is the main part of the show. So a subsidiary of United Health Group, Optum Data Lake, Optum's data lake architecture, just ultimately couldn't support at scale that it needed to operate at. Like, the majority of Optum's data resided in petabytes of Hadoop's data lakes, and it was in silos across SAS and Microsoft SQL Server and Teradata and Postgres databases. And they have over 10,000 users that needed to access all this distributed data. And so previously, Optum would rely on Hive and Spark SQL for all their analytics, but querying the 2 different databases required copying data from one to another, or engaging in expensive ETL operations and queries that were just taking too long. And so with Starburst, Optum has now ultimately accelerated its ad hoc queries that are now 10x faster than what they were getting from Hive, and 2 to 3x faster than what they were getting with Spark. They're also seeing a 30% drop in the infrastructure resources because Starburst separates that storage from the compute. And they're also seeing a painless and seamless global security management for all the PHI. So making sure that people have the right level of column and row level access on the data to protect the PHI data that they are responsible for. They also don't have to worry about ETL or data duplication anymore. And ultimately, what they're seeing is just savings, success, and flexibility, right? So they're seeing their teams be more performant. They're seeing a reduction in their infrastructure costs. They're also anticipating millions in savings thanks to the analytics insights uncovered because of Starburst, or I should say with Starburst. And so the next customer we want to look at is Novant Health. So they operate out of the southeast region of the United States with their headquarters in North Carolina. And they're a nonprofit organization with 35,000 team members, more than 1,800 physicians across 800 locations. And so Novant uses Starburst as an abstraction layer between its varied data sources and the various analysts and data scientists that are trying to use the systems. Data engineers who might have had to wait months to source and curate data to satisfy the complex use cases now have immediate access through Starburst, remember, because they don't have to worry about that data movement anymore, and they're just going directly to the source. And with Starburst, Novant is now enhancing its analytics muscles around billing, social determinants for health, personalized experiences and care plans, and several other down funnel use cases to help move their business forward. And so, as I mentioned before, the Starburst orbit is comprised, and this is our partner ecosystem, of a rich, growing ecosystem of partners across every layer, right? So whether it's the infrastructure providers that you see at the bottom of the stack, including your major three that you would expect, but also organizations like Red Hat and HPE, all the way up to our consulting partners like Slalom, Deloitte, McKinsey, Bain, et cetera, and everybody in between. And this is a growing network that's building around Starburst of partners that we're working with. And we also hold true with the optionality, even in our procurement model, offering customers choice between self-managed or a SaaS offering across all major marketplaces with numerous consumption and pricing models and flexible billing options. So you choose your journey, and that best suits what your business needs today, and then adapt it to what it may need tomorrow. And so with that concludes this portion of the talk. What I'd like to start doing is invite some of our panelists onto stage next. And then let's get the fireside chat on the show. So if I may invite all three, David, Adrian, and John, to turn on your cameras and let's go ahead and get set up. To kick off, if each of you could quickly introduce yourselves and why you're here today with us.
Great pleasure to be here. I'm David Berkowitz. I'm the head of product R&D at Novant Health, and that includes data science. Prior to that, I was a co-founder and CTO of PatientPing, and we were acquired by the company that I'm in now. And prior to that, I spent almost 2 decades working at the Lab of Computer Science at the Mass General, looking at data and sort of building applications in that space.
All right. So what I take from that is that you have a lot of experience in the healthcare and life sciences space, and you're extremely credible.
Yeah, well, you can see my head versus the picture. I have even less hair now than I did then. So
awesome. All right, Adrian, please, I know you've already spoken, but please introduce yourself to the audience.
Glad to. Thank you, Manveer. And Manveer, that was awesome. I really, you gave a lot of content there. I hope we can try to summarize it here in this fireside chat. So you heard me open the session up. My name is Adrian Estala. I'm the field CDO here at Starburst, former CDO before. So my purpose and hopefully my role here is to sit alongside David and John and kind of share my strategic view from a CDO perspective on some of these challenges and the conversations we're having with healthcare companies and other organizations. John, how about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. So my name's John Marshall. I'm a data and analytics capability leader at Slalom. Slalom's a business and technology consulting firm. We're currently in 8 countries, about 45 markets, and we focus both on strategy and implementation. So in my role here, I help organizations both in and out of the HLS sector solve some of their most challenging data problems. So most recently, I've been partnering with one of the largest payers in the US to define and roll out data federation strategy and operating model.
All right, so it looks like we have the right folks on the call today. All right, and before we dive into the actual chat, I do want to remind the audience, for those of you with us today, feel free to put questions into the chat function there. And like I said, we have a team on standby to be able to answer those, and we'll also try to get to some of them in the discussion today as well. But with that said, David, I'm going to start with you first, right? We've spoken a couple of times now before, and in a previous conversation, you had shared your views around this whole patient care or patient 360. Would you please kick us off by quickly elaborating on what you mean for those in the audience that may possibly be unfamiliar with this concept? And so that's part of the first question. And then what are some of the data challenges you've had to overcome to get where you are today with enabling this whole patient care experience that you were talking about?
Sure. So I'll try and summarize this as best I can. So the way I think about Patient 360 is that when a provider has a patient in front of them, what they're seeing is potentially just a snapshot view of the problems that patient has at this point. But the reality is that that patient has a long history that goes back in time that really influences the decisions that that provider has to make given the presenting symptoms. And those sort of history that you have actually extends in yet another dimension, because that provider may only have access to data that is available in their silo. And they may be missing information that's really relevant that may exist in other silos, which are really represented by other places that patient may have been. So our job is to integrate all of this different information together so that that provider has the best information and context that they can then use to decide how to best treat that patient. Now, in our particular business, we get data that comes through real-time data feeds that sort of give us insight into events that may have occurred to that patient. And in addition, we have data that comes through from controlled substances. And the integration of these two different data sources provides us with a much better picture around what's happening to that patient. If we now add yet other data streams, say, for example, related to behavioral health or critical or crisis management, that really starts to round out this whole picture and provides newer insights to the provider who's actually seeing the patient at that time.
Okay, you laid a trap for a question that I want to follow up with you on around all the opioid data that you referred to. So we'll come back to that one in just a second. But Adrian, I want to bring you into this. You and John actually both engage with healthcare organizations frequently. So Adrian, starting with you first, how would you rank a whole patient care experience on the prioritization stack for providers today?
Yeah, I think with the customers we're working with, and I think you asked the question the right way, right? There are healthcare providers where a patient 360 model is really important. And there's two lenses there, right? One is providing the patient in a very transparent way a view of everything that fits their profile, their health profile, all that privacy information, as well as the opportunities in front of them. Here are the services that you can use. Here are the recommendations, and here's your specific profile, so you can kind of understand your own health, so to speak. That's one lens. The other lens is as David described, the practitioner's view, right? So the nurse practitioner's view of that patient, so they can make sure that they're providing the best advice, providing the best prescription, so to speak, and making sure that all that information is available to them when they sit down to diagnose. I want to offer you a third lens, and we also work with insurers. And I know one of the insurers we're working with is looking at better ways, using that same patient 360 model, looking at better ways to recommend the right drugs for oncology patients or anybody with an illness, to make sure that they are using the right medication in the right way at the right time, so that, again, to improve their own health. So a couple of different lenses when we think about patient 360. There's the patient lens, the practitioner lens, and I think there's also the insurance lens. Awesome.
And then, John, so twofold question for you. Would you, first of all, agree with both of those responses or disagree? And then second, if we reflect back on the challenges that David cited, right, and based on the experience of, the organizations that you work with at Slalom, how would you say that those tech challenges stack up against the broader data challenges that impact patient care experiences and provider operations?
Well, for the first question, yes, I would absolutely agree, and not just because I don't want to start an argument here on the webinar. It's absolutely true. And the challenges, they're very tightly aligned with the broader challenges that organizations in the sector are facing. I look at the title of this webinar, right? Connecting the data dots, and creating a patient 360, understanding the broader view of a patient really comes down to connecting the dots. And the challenges there are twofold, right? One, it comes down to access, right? Do we have access to all of these different data sources at the right time to make the right decisions? And then second is, the compliance and regulatory challenges that arise so frequently in the HLS space. Are we doing the right things to ensure that we're accessing this data in a compliant way, so as to avoid the rather harsh penalties that can arise from doing it incorrectly, but while also delivering value for the patients that we're seeking to help?
Okay. You've actually set the stage for my follow-up question that was for David very well, right? Talking about compliance and regulatory, requirements and just being, a good steward of the data. David, this goes back to your comment around the opioid, right? And the data that you use there to kind of create this whole patient care experience. If I recall, opioid data is actually extremely sensitive in the United States, and it's actually governed at the state level. So how do you meet those requirements, but still provide that whole patient care experience for people or for providers?
Yeah, so this is actually a really good question because it cuts across a number of different issues. So yes, opioids are tightly controlled at a state level, but states do not necessarily all share the same data governance requirements. So there are some commonalities between the states, but the end result is that that state's data has to be kept within a particular silo. And it means that any insights that you can gather from that data can only go back to the owner of that data, meaning the state, unless states have established relationships between each other that allow sharing. So that's one of the challenges we have, where we have to understand the data governance for each data stream specifically, and that data cannot be easily intermingled with other data. So that means that the governance, the provenance, the lifespan of that data has to be managed independently for each one of these. The other aspects to this then is, well, how do we introduce information into this ecosystem that then helps the states sort of use their information more effectively and more efficiently? So I'll take a use case that I think may be illustrative of this. Let's say that a patient takes a lot of opioids, and you can see that through their prescriptions. The challenge is, how do you determine that that patient is got chronic pain from being an addict, or maybe this is just a bad provider? And so what we are able to do by integrating data across these different silos is to start to look for patterns that start to help us understand whether or not we can differentiate whether somebody is, got some serious osteoporosis or back pain from somebody who's actually just drug seeking. And so the ability that we have to integrate across these different sources and yet not contravene any of the specific data governance rules is something that we wouldn't be able to do without a tool like Starburst. It really facilitates that access. And as long as we feed that information in the right direction, we don't contravene any regulations or any governance rules.
Awesome. So you're able to create, add value to folks and to patients and to providers and to their organizations that they're, they're working for as well. Meet all the regulatory requirements at the same time of making sure that you're also just, providing this holistic view of the patient himself, him or herself as well. So that's great. I do want to quickly, just for time, switch to different topics. Before we switch to the core topic next, lunch is coming up here. And for some folks and for others, you may have already eaten lunch. But like David, what's an analytics sandwich?
Okay, so this is the notion that there is a single source of truth, and that forms the filling of the sandwich. And on one side, the bread faces the customers, and this is, maybe it goes through some sort of analytics piece, but essentially the customer is looking down at that source of truth through some layer. And the other side of the sandwich is also an analytics view, but this is really oriented towards data science and much deeper analytics, so that you can look at that exact same source of truth, derive the value and pieces of insights out of that information, and then feed it back into the filling so that it can then emerge back to the customer. And so conceptually, I just think about these two different analytic layers with the same data in the middle. And in our particular case, Starburst is actually part of that inner sort of layer of bread, if you like.
Okay. This is a question for the audience. How many of you would like to see a blog post on defining the analytics sandwich written by David, John, and Adrian? Just comment in the chat if that's something you're interested in seeing, and we'll see if we can get that compiled for you guys. Awesome. I definitely, when you talk about food and it's time to eat, like the saliva definitely starts kicking in. But we're going to switch over to a different topic. All right. So, I'm sure everybody's read all the news that's out there at some point in time with all these industry reports about the growing volumes of data and what are we doing with it? And we're only using like X%. I think it's like less than 10% actually gets used globally for meaningful stuff. But healthcare specifically is posed, is set to actually dominate the data creation, globally in the coming years, where it become the largest generator of data. How do you think about, and David, we'll start with you, and John, feel free to chime in along with Adrian as a response or a follow-up. But David, how, as somebody who's providing technology to healthcare organizations as well, how do you think about the overall growth and the costs of the data in healthcare?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's really gone through quite a radical sort of change because, many years ago, nobody wanted to share the data. And everybody would claim ownership of their data, all the way from the patient through to the institution that was paying for the electronic medical record to gather it. And what we've seen evolve over time is that data has become much more of a commodity. And really the cost has shifted from the data acquisition piece to now actually the data storage component. What I think is really important to understand about healthcare data, though, is that it has a time sensitivity. So if you think about a real-time data feed that tells you a patient is in the emergency room right now, that data is very valuable. But the patient may only be in that emergency room for 30 minutes to an hour, and that information is no longer valid. So if one thinks about, well, we have all this data, what is its real value? I think we're starting to see that medicine and the practice of medicine, the financial components of medicine, as it changes from the fee-for-service model, which is really now, what is wrong with you now? That time component is now shifting into value-based care, where the information that has accumulated over time for that patient has changed. And I think that feeds very well into the idea of how one can use data to now improve this model of how you actually sort of treat a patient and how you maintain the health of the patient. And I think that shift in change of practice really maps very closely now to the access that we get to data and how we can actually use that data effectively to sort of keep promoting that model.
Awesome. So if I were to sum that up, what I'm hearing you is moving towards, using all that data to move towards more of a proactive care model, right? So if I were a patient using my Apple Watch data for telemetry on my steps and everything else, the smart scale, my dietary elements, and all moving, a provider being able to use that to proactively look at and provide guidance on care plans for me. Would that be fair enough?
Yeah, so that's a really good example. Let's say you have a bout of atrial fibrillation, right? So some irregular heart rhythm. It's really important that they know about that at that point, because you may pass out, you may faint, or something could happen. But then if you take a few steps back, that pattern of when it may occur over time is also really relevant, because it's indicative of the disease process underlying that condition. So the individual piece is important at that time, but really to understand how and what those factors are, one looks at it at a much larger time span.
Awesome. John, I want to invite you in on this as well. So, you've heard David's response there, but with all the organizations across providers, payers, and life sciences that you're working with, what are some of the best practices or tactics that you're seeing them employ to address the data volumes and the costs that they're seeing as well?
Yeah, David gave great context into a little bit more of the business and operations side of things, and from my perspective, what I think about is, how do I get a handle on this architecturally and from a process perspective as these data volumes and the costs associated with them explode. And what I'm seeing a lot of is this move to a data federation and lakehouse architecture model, right? So you talked about it at length, Manveer, but providing access from multiple sources without actually physically moving data into a single repository. So you're reducing spend on storage. I think more more important to highlight that some folks might not think about even is you're reducing spend on data engineering, which is often the most expensive part of moving data around. I think there are a couple of important drivers for success when we think about effectively implementing a data federation or a lakehouse approach. Certainly isn't an exhaustive list, but the first one that comes to mind is data governance and metadata management, right? So if we have a strong governance framework in place, we can streamline those data management processes. We can ensure data quality. We can start to eliminate some of the duplication that really does start to balloon up our data storage costs. And I think, most importantly in the HLS space, it's even more critical just due to the regulatory requirements that are imposed on the data in question, and the fact that we need to have a strong grip on who's accessing what. And then second would be...
So John, actually, before you go to the second one, I want to change that a little bit. Thank you. So John, just on that one, it's great for these patterns. I think a lot of these, like the top 3 or the top 5, most people are familiar with. In your opinion, though, what's the one that gets most overlooked as organizations think about this, right? And what you see is like, if only they would have figured that out earlier on, it would have saved a lot of the pain that they're realizing now today.
It's got to be metadata management. I see a lot of large organizations scrambling to figure metadata management out now in a time where their data volumes have never been bigger. And so it's much harder to get metadata management under control when you have this massive ecosystem of data. But really metadata is the key to unlocking access, reliability, and usability, and ultimately value of the data, because without it, your users can't go and find it. And so going and tackling metadata is one of the primary things I would recommend organizations do, alongside getting their architecture in the right place.
Cool. And John, you've teed up the question for Adrian very well there with architecture. Adrian, as we wrap up this portion of the topics here in the fireside chat, how does a modern data lake architecture or data lake fit into all of this when you think about what David said about the growing volumes and going into more proactive care plans, and the guidance and what John shared with the metadata and just overall access and everything else?
Yeah, great. And I'll be as brief as possible. I know we got a few minutes left. First, it's inspiring to listen to people like David talk about the opportunities in the front end. And so it's not, and you're talking healthcare, it's just not the idea of being profitable for a company, but even greater than that, it's the idea of actually changing somebody's life, and that's inspiring. So this is an area that's especially kind of dear when we do data work here, because we know we're affecting somebody's life. So if we want to be able to deliver against that inspiration, so to speak, I think the challenges we have in the back end is we think about leveraging what we have in place. We don't have the time to wait to move the data or change the data or fix the data. We have to kind of work with what we have. And so the advice that I have for organizations in healthcare and banks or in other places is let's leverage what you have today. And so you heard John say that a second ago, that means we're leveraging the lakes you already have, right? Those lakes are powerful, right? I think for a while there, we thought that we were having to kind of build everything in warehouses, which works really well if you know the question, if you have the metadata and you know the data. But as we're now starting to explore more and more data across our health organizations that we've never touched before, or that we really don't know how we're going to use it yet. I don't know the question and I don't know the data for things like AI, for example. A lake is perfect. And so if we can leverage the data where it sits, exploit our lakes to the fullest potential, and federate across everything else, that's the right recipe for creating an impact right now today. But that's also the right recipe, if you go back to my Einstein slide, for making sure that we're sustainable for the future, because that architecture can shift, that architecture can change without impacting the front end, without slowing down the front end. So, and what I mean by change, when you're federated and you create that virtual layer, it creates abstraction between what the consumers use and need versus what's really going on the back end. So there's my short answer in 2 minutes or less, but a really good question.
We're gonna have to work on short answers there, Adrian. All right, cool. So we're entering the final segment here, right? And I want to once again thanks all the option for all of you. John, you're gonna kick this off first. Healthcare globally is in the midst of this data renaissance, right? You could read data is oil, data is water, whatever data is, that's fine. But it's a lifeline. And over the past several decades, there have been a lot of these best practices that have been developed when it comes to the data architectures. I don't want to know the best practices. What I would love to hear from each of you, and John, you'll kick this off, What is the one thing that you wish folks would stop doing that was once deemed a best practice?
Very easy. Stop saying single source of truth.
Okay, great. Best response. I think the webinar is done. David, what about you?
I think that, in healthcare, there's always been this notion about protecting data, not letting it out. And I think if people can really understand the value that this returns to the patients themselves, then I think that would be a huge step forward.
Awesome. And Adrian, bring us to a close.
I love those two answers. The only one I'll add is stop thinking central IT will do it all, right? Enable and empower your end users, your consumers to do more on their own.
Awesome. Great advice. And once again, everybody, thank you so much. I also want to thank all of our speakers today, David, John, and Adrian. Thank you for sharing all your insights based on your own personal experiences in the organizations that you work with and represent. And that concludes today's webinar. And thank you once again. Take care.